patriot's dream, manufacturing loyalty in the atomic age from classroom pledges to comic book heroes, the quiet war for national faith. In the autumn of 1947, a boy named Thomas Harlow stood in a schoolroom in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, his right hand pressed against his chest, his voice joining 30 others in a rhythm he knew by heart but did not understand. Every morning at 8:15 the same words filled the air: one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The teacher stood by the window, her gaze distant, her lips moving in silent sync. Outside, the cornfield stretched endlessly under a pale sky, and somewhere beyond them, the world was rebuilding itself from the ashes of a war that had ended only 2 years before. Thomas didn't think about any of that. He thought about the flag hanging above the chalkboard, how its colors seemed brighter than anything else in the room, how it made him feel small and important at the same time. He didn't know it yet, but that feeling was the point. It had been designed, tested, refined across decades of psychological engineering, and by the time it reached him, it was invisible. The pledge was not just a ritual. It was an implant, a daily reinforcement of belonging, a way to make loyalty feel like love. This is not a story about propaganda in the traditional sense. It is not about posters or speeches or tanks rolling through city streets. This is about something quieter, something far more effective. The systematic construction of national identity in the minds of children who never questioned where their beliefs came from. Between 1945 and 1965, in the shadow of the atomic bomb and the rise of the Cold War, the United States government, in collaboration with media corporations, educational institutions, and psychological advisors, waged a silent campaign to manufacture patriotism. They did not call it mind control. They called it civic education, character building, moral guidance. But the methods they used were drawn from the same wells of behavioral science that had been tested in wartime propaganda labs, the same techniques used to break prisoners and condition soldiers. The goal was simple: to create a generation that would never doubt, never resist, never ask why. And it worked. The architects of this campaign understood one fundamental truth about human psychology: loyalty is not inherited, it is learned. A child is born without allegiance to any nation, any flag, any ideal. But a child is also born with a hunger for belonging, for structure, for stories that explain the world. If you control the stories, you control the child. If you repeat those stories often enough, with enough emotional weight, they become indistinguishable from truth. This was not theory. This was applied science, refined through decades of research into conditioning, repetition, and associative learning. Pavlov had demonstrated it with dogs and bells. Watson had applied it to human infants. Skinner had systematized it into a predictable framework. And by the end of World War II, every major government on Earth understood that the real battlefield was not in Europe or the Pacific. It was in the classroom, in the living room, in the pages of a comic book. The Pledge of Allegiance itself had been written in 1892 by a Baptist minister named Francis Bellamy, originally intended as a marketing tool to sell flags to public schools during a nationalist fervor surrounding the Columbian Exposition. It was short, rhythmic, easy to memorize, and deliberately vague enough to avoid sectarian conflict. For decades it remained optional, a patriotic gesture but not a requirement. That changed in 1942, 1 year into America's involvement in World War II, when Congress officially adopted it as a national standard. The timing was not coincidental. The war had exposed a psychological vulnerability. American identity was fragile, divided by class, region, ethnicity, and political belief. If the nation was to mobilize effectively, if it was to sustain morale through years of sacrifice, it needed a unifying symbol, a shared emotional anchor. The flag became that anchor. And the pledge became the daily ritual that welded it into the nervous system of every schoolchild in the country. But the pledge alone was not enough. Repetition creates familiarity, but it does not create meaning. To make the ritual work, it had to be embedded in a larger narrative, a mythology of what it meant to be American. This is where the real engineering began. In 1948, the Department of Defense, working in coordination with the newly formed Central Intelligence Agency, established a covert advisory board known internally as the Committee on National Morale. Its members included former OSS psychological warfare specialists, advertising executives from Madison Avenue, educators from Harvard and Columbia, and scriptwriters from Hollywood. Their mandate was simple: to identify the most effective methods of instilling patriotic sentiment in peacetime populations, with a particular focus on youth. The committee's findings were never published. They were classified under national security protocols and remained buried in federal archives until partial declassification in the 1990s. What those documents reveal is a chillingly systematic approach to emotional conditioning. The committee's research began with a simple question: what makes a child love their country? They studied existing models: Soviet youth programs, Nazi indoctrination methods, British imperial education systems. They analyzed folk songs, fairy tales, religious hymns. They conducted surveys, focus groups, psychological assessments, and they arrived at a conclusion that would shape American culture for the next 2 decades. A child's love of country is not rational. It is not based on policy or history or civic understanding. It is emotional, tribal, and deeply tied to identity formation during the years between ages 5 and 14. To cultivate that love, you must associate national symbols with feelings of safety, pride, and belonging. You must make the child feel that they are part of something larger than themselves, something noble and eternal. And you must do this before they develop the critical faculties to question it. The committee identified 3 primary vectors for this conditioning: education, entertainment, and community ritual. Each would be weaponized in its own way, each designed to reinforce the others in a seamless web of influence. The first vector, education, was the most direct. By 1950, new federal guidelines were quietly distributed to state education boards across the country, recommending specific changes to history curricula, civics lessons, and classroom procedures. The guidelines were framed as suggestions, not mandates, but they came with financial incentives. Schools that adopted the recommended programs would receive increased federal funding for textbooks, infrastructure, and teacher salaries. Most schools complied without question. The changes were subtle. History textbooks began to emphasize American exceptionalism, the idea that the United States was uniquely virtuous, a beacon of freedom in a darkening world. Founding figures were elevated to mythic status, their flaws erased, their words recontextualized to serve contemporary political goals. The Revolutionary War was framed not as a tax revolt but as a moral crusade. The Civil War became a story of inevitable progress, the violence sanitized, the compromises forgotten. World War II was portrayed as a clear battle between good and evil, with no mention of strategic ambiguities, internment camps, or the geopolitical motivations that preceded Pearl Harbor. But it wasn't just what was taught, it was how it was taught. Classroom procedures were redesigned to emphasize conformity, obedience, and collective identity. Students stood in unison, spoke in unison, moved in unison. Individuality was tolerated only within carefully defined boundaries. Questioning authority was reframed as disrespect. Dissent was treated as disloyalty. Teachers were instructed to model patriotic enthusiasm, to speak of the nation with reverence, to display symbols, flags, portraits of presidents, maps emphasizing American territorial dominance, in prominent positions. The goal was not to teach children how to think but what to feel. And it worked. Surveys conducted in the mid-1950s showed that an overwhelming majority of American schoolchildren believed their country was morally superior to all others, that its government was fundamentally just, and that questioning its decisions was a form of betrayal. The second vector, entertainment, was more insidious because it felt voluntary. Children did not watch cartoons or read comic books because they were forced to, they did it because they wanted to. And that made the messages embedded within those stories far more powerful. The entertainment industry had learned this lesson during World War II, when studios like Disney and Warner Brothers produced propaganda films that were indistinguishable from regular programming. Donald Duck became a symbol of American resilience. Bugs Bunny outwitted Nazi caricatures. Superman fought saboteurs and encouraged war bond purchases. These were not clumsy political ads. They were stories, emotionally engaging and narratively satisfying, with the propaganda woven so seamlessly into the fabric of the plot that audiences absorbed it without resistance. After the war, this approach did not end. It evolved. In 1949, a confidential meeting was held in Los Angeles between representatives from the Department of Defense, the CIA's newly formed Office of Policy Coordination, and executives from major comic book publishers including DC Comics, Marvel, and EC Comics. The meeting was not recorded in any official capacity, but multiple sources, including declassified CIA memos and interviews with former industry insiders, confirmed that it took place. The purpose was to discuss how comic books, which had become the dominant form of youth entertainment with an estimated readership of over 60 million children per month, could be used to promote pro-American values and counter-communist influence. The publishers were not coerced. They were willing participants, many of them motivated by genuine patriotic sentiment, others by financial incentives in the form of government contracts and tax benefits. The result was a subtle but pervasive shift in comic book narratives. Superheroes who had previously fought gangsters, mad scientists, and generic evildoers now found themselves battling Cold War threats: Soviet spies, communist infiltrators, atomic saboteurs. Captain America, who had been retired after the war, was revived in 1954 explicitly as an anti-communist crusader. His stories framed the ideological conflict in clear moral terms. America represented freedom, the Soviet Union represented tyranny, and there was no middle ground. Other heroes followed suit. Superman became a guardian of the American way, his adventures increasingly focused on protecting national security. Even characters like Batman, whose stories were typically grounded in urban crime, began encountering enemies with vaguely foreign accents and anti-American agendas. But the influence went deeper than plotlines. It was embedded in the visual language of the comics themselves. American flags appeared constantly in backgrounds, on uniforms, and splash pages. Heroes were depicted in heroic poses with the flag draped behind them, creating a subconscious association between strength, virtue, and national identity. Television, which exploded into American homes in the early 1950s, became the most powerful vector of all. By 1955, over half of American households owned a television set, and by 1960, that number had risen to nearly 90%. Television was unlike any previous medium. It was immediate, intimate, and omnipresent. It brought the world into the living room, but more importantly, it brought a curated version of the world, one shaped by networks, sponsors, and government advisors. Programs like I Led 3 Lives, which dramatized the story of an FBI informant infiltrating a communist cell, presented Cold War anxieties in thriller format. Game shows like Name That Tune and The Price is Right celebrated consumer abundance as a distinctly American virtue. Family sitcoms like Father Knows Best and Leave It to Beaver depicted an idealized suburban life where order, conformity, and patriarchal authority were synonymous with happiness. But the most insidious influence came not from specific programs but from the commercials between them. Advertisers had learned from wartime propaganda that emotional appeals were far more effective than rational arguments. They used the same techniques: association, repetition, idealization, to link their products to concepts like freedom, progress, and the American dream. A Chevrolet commercial wasn't just selling a car, it was selling mobility, independence, the open road as a metaphor for national possibility. A Coca-Cola ad wasn't just promoting a soft drink, it was creating a mythology of shared experience, of small-town innocence, of a simpler, purer America that may never have existed but felt real because it was repeated so often. Children who grew up in this environment didn't just consume these messages, they internalized them. By the time Thomas Harlow, the boy from Cedar Rapids, reached high school in 1956, his understanding of the world had been shaped by a decade of carefully orchestrated conditioning. He believed, without ever questioning it, that America was the greatest nation on earth. He believed that communism was not just a different political system but a moral evil. He believed that loyalty to his country was the highest virtue, that questioning its leaders was dangerous, that conformity was safety. These were not ideas he had consciously chosen. They were reflexes, emotional certainties that felt like his own thoughts but had been planted there by forces he had never seen. The campaign was not without opposition. In the early 1950s, a small but vocal group of educators, psychologists, and civil libertarians began to raise concerns about what they called indoctrination in public schools. They pointed to the increased emphasis on rote memorization, the suppression of critical thinking, the treatment of patriotism as a mandatory emotion rather than a voluntary sentiment. Some argued that the methods being used were fundamentally authoritarian, more suited to totalitarian regimes than to a democratic society. A few brave voices, including educational reformer John Holt and psychologist Eric Fromm, published critiques warning that the obsession with loyalty and conformity was creating a generation of obedient citizens incapable of independent thought. These critiques were largely ignored. In the political climate of the early Cold War, any criticism of American patriotism was viewed with suspicion. To question the pledge was to question the flag. To question the flag was to question the nation. And to question the nation was to align oneself, however unintentionally, with the enemy. Teachers who refused to lead the pledge were fired. Academics who published critical analyses were labeled subversives. In some cases, they were called before the House Un-American Activities Committee and forced to defend their loyalty in public hearings. The message was clear: dissent would not be tolerated. And so the campaign continued, unchallenged and unexamined, shaping millions of young minds in silence. By 1960, the results were undeniable. A generation of Americans had been raised in an environment where national loyalty was not just encouraged but engineered. They had been conditioned from childhood to associate their country with safety, virtue, and identity. They had been taught to see the world in binary terms: us versus them, freedom versus tyranny, good versus evil. They had been trained to respond emotionally, not rationally, to symbols of national authority. And when the time came when their country called on them to serve, to fight, to die in wars whose moral clarity was far less obvious than the stories they had been told, most of them went willingly. Not because they understood the geopolitical complexities, not because they had carefully weighed the ethical implications, but because they had been taught from the earliest age that to love your country was to obey it without question. Vietnam was the test. In 1965, when the first major deployments of American ground troops arrived in Southeast Asia, most of them were young men born in the late 1940s and early 1950s, the first cohort to grow up fully immersed in the post-war patriotic conditioning. They had recited the pledge every morning. They had read Captain America and Superman. They had watched war movies where American soldiers were always heroes and the cause was always just. They believed, with the unshakable certainty of a creed learned in childhood, that they were fighting for freedom, that their cause was righteous, that their sacrifice had meaning. The government told them this. Their teachers had told them this. Their comic books had told them this. And so they believed it. But the reality they encountered in Vietnam bore no resemblance to the stories they had been told. There were no clear heroes, no obvious villains, no moral certainties. The enemy was invisible, often indistinguishable from civilians. The mission was vague, shifting, contradictory. The tactics required, burning villages, destroying crops, relocating populations, were the same tactics they had been taught to despise when used by totalitarian regimes. And slowly, painfully, some of them began to realize that the war they were fighting was not the war they had imagined. The conditioning did not break all at once. It cracked slowly, under the weight of lived experience that contradicted everything they had been taught to believe. For many, the disillusionment was profound, almost spiritual in its devastation. They had been raised to see their country as a force for good, and now they were forced to confront evidence that it was capable of great cruelty. They had been taught that patriotism meant obedience, and now they were discovering that obedience could lead to atrocity. The psychological damage was immense, and it lingered long after they returned home. Post-traumatic stress disorder, which the military initially refused to acknowledge, was not just a response to combat trauma, it was also a response to cognitive dissonance, the collapse of a belief system that had been constructed over a lifetime. But even as some questioned, many more did not. The conditioning held. Millions of Americans, safely at home, continued to support the war because they could not conceive of their country being wrong. They waved flags at parades, they put yellow ribbons on their trees, they denounced protesters as traitors. The narratives they had internalized as children remained intact, impervious to evidence, because they were not rational beliefs. They were emotional certainties, identity-forming convictions that could not be abandoned without abandoning a sense of self. The architects of the campaign understood this. They had always understood it. In a 1963 internal memo from the Committee on National Morale, since declassified, one advisor wrote, "The goal is not to make citizens who agree with policy, but citizens who cannot imagine disagreeing. We are not seeking compliance, we are seeking reflexive loyalty. And the key is to establish that loyalty before the age of reason, so that by the time critical faculties develop, the emotional architecture is already in place." This was not a mistake. This was not an unintended consequence. This was the plan. The campaign did not end with Vietnam. It continued, adapting to new media, new threats, new generations. In the 1980s, the emphasis shifted to celebrating military power and economic dominance. In the 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the narratives refocused on American exceptionalism and the triumph of capitalism. In the 2000s, after September 11th, the conditioning intensified around themes of security, sacrifice, and the eternal threat of terrorism. The methods evolved. Cable news replaced comic books, social media replaced television, but the underlying principles remain the same. Control the stories. Repeat them constantly. Associate national identity with emotional certainty. And begin the process early before critical thinking can interfere. Thomas Harlow, the boy from Cedar Rapids, is 65 years old now. He lives in a retirement community in Arizona, surrounded by others who grew up in the same era, shaped by the same forces. He still believes in the pledge he recited every morning as a child. He still believes in the heroes he read about in comic books. He still believes that his country, despite its flaws, is fundamentally good. He has never questioned where those beliefs came from. He has never wondered why they feel so certain, so unshakable, so much like his own thoughts even though they were planted there long ago by people he never met. And perhaps that is the greatest success of the campaign. Not that it created loyalty, but that it made that loyalty feel natural, inevitable, as though it had always been there. This is the quiet war. Not the war of bombs and bullets, but the war of ideas and emotions, fought not on battlefields but in classrooms, living rooms, and the private spaces of the mind. It is the war to control what you believe before you know you are believing it, to shape your identity before you understand what identity means, to make you love your country so deeply that the love becomes indistinguishable from yourself. And it is still being waged, every day in every nation, by those who understand that the most effective weapon is not the one that destroys the body, but the one that captures the mind. The archives are full of stories like this. Stories of experiments and operations, of systems designed to manipulate, control, and condition. Stories that were never meant to be told, filed away in classified documents and forgotten histories. But the truth does not disappear simply because it is hidden. It waits, patient and silent, for those willing to look. If you've listened this far, you already know too much. The Patriot's dream was never a dream at all. It was an architecture, a system, a machine that built belief where none existed and called it freedom. Subscribe to War Archives Black and remember, loyalty is not born. It is manufactured. And the factory is still running.